Verse 10, we have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. I know we're moving quickly. I want to read this through and we're going to talk about it. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore, let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. I want to explain something before we really dig into the meat of that argument. Inside the tabernacle of Moses, all of the accoutrements of the tabernacle, not totally relevant for our understanding of this lesson, but all of them are vital. They all hold some sort of spiritual meaning. And in the outer courtyard of the tabernacle is the brazen altar. And the brazen altar is the place where they would take the meat from the sacrifice, where there's a lamb, a goat, a bull, a pigeon, a turtle dove, and they would bring its body in and put it on the altar, and they would offer it up as a sacrifice to God, but they would actually do the killing. They would do the slaughter, the cleaning of it outside the camp. And so you would gut it, for lack of a better term, outside, and then bring the meat in and lay it on the altar before God. And then whenever it was fully cooked, your sacrifice was finished. And your sacrifice wasn't finished until it was well done. Pardon the pun, that's the way it was. It had to be a finished work for you to be finished. And it was a crime in God's economy to take the meat off the altar before it was finished. And there's a story in the Old Testament about some priests who did that and got themselves in big trouble because it's a type and shadow of us taking Jesus off the cross before the work is finished, so that people don't get to see how the work is finished. And if you don't get to see how the work is finished, your heart's not going to be established in grace. Your heart's going to be established in what you do right and what you do wrong. And so it's always a matter of trying to watch how the work got finished. Now, the author says we have an altar that's different from that altar. He goes, our altar, the bodies of those animals, their blood was brought in by the high priest, but their bodies were burned outside the camp. So what would happen is they would burn the waste on a fire outside the camp, not the brazen altar, on a dumpster fire. And a type of New Testament Gehenna. Okay, because when you get to the New Testament, there's Gehenna, which gets mistranslated as hell. And what happens in Gehenna is it's a trash heap right outside of Jerusalem where dead bodies and refuse and waste went, and there was a fire that burned forever and the worm died not. That's how the book of Isaiah ends. He goes, there's a spot where stuff burns and the worm lasts forever and doesn't die. And then 1,000 years later, that got turned into a spiritual place called hell in the heart of the earth where people burn forever and forever. But that's my apologetics for whether hell is the place you think it is or not could be saved for another sermon. But outside the camp, they burn up the waste and the excess. They bring the blood in and they pour the blood out on the altar. And the blood then becomes the sacrifice that people see. And this is why Christians connect the blood with the redemption of their sins, because you could see the blood on the altar, and therefore the blood of Christ becomes the redemption that frees you from condemnation. But you took everything else outside. The author wants to put Jesus there too. Therefore, Jesus, so that he might sanctify, that set us aside, so that we might be set aside, Jesus, with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. So the author of Hebrews goes, hey, I've heard Jesus died on a hill outside of Jerusalem. Guess what? So did the animals in the Old Testament. They would die and suffer, and we romanticize their death because we saw the meat on the altar and the blood on the altar, but in reality, the screaming of their death happened out there. He said, so Jesus goes outside of the city. He goes outside of Jerusalem and he suffers and he dies outside the camp. And then here's the ultimate connection. Therefore, let's go forth to him outside the camp bearing his reproach. And so the author says, so if we're going to accept Jesus, we're going to have to go outside of something. We're going to have to go outside of our camp. We're going to have to go outside of our house. We're going to have to go outside of something. We have to leave where we are to go to where he is because he's there. And therefore, if I'm going to join together with him, I got to mark the spot where he dies. and I have to go die there as well. And we know, because this whole thing's allegory, we know he's not telling us that the only way to come to Christ is to go to a spot outside of natural Jerusalem. But much deeper than that, the only way to go to Christ is to go to Christ's place of death. And in doing so, you're going to have to leave something. You're going to have to go out of one place and go into another place, because that's the spot of the cross.